Hello, today we're talking about phase as it relates to sound. So let's first of all define what phase is. Well, it's the position in a wave where we begin the reproduction or playing of that wave. So if we look at the sine wave that's on screen at the moment, if you pressed a key and it started playing exactly as you see it, then that wave would have 0 degrees phase, which means that as soon as it starts to sound, it begins to sound from this point onwards. And then over the course of the period of time over which this sine wave is replicated, we have positive values until the sine wave reaches its maximum amplitude, its maximum loudness at 90 degrees phase, and then it carries on playing. The wave is actually diminishing in amplitude at this point until it gets to 0, that's 180 degrees phase, and then carries on and eventually gets back round to where it started. That's completed one full wave period, and that's 360 degrees, which is the same as 0. If you're playing a single sound, a single waveform, then phase has no meaning or value whatsoever. The only time when phase becomes interesting is when you're playing multiple sounds simultaneously and they may be interacting with each other. And the way that waves interact with each other is, imagine if you stood at the ocean seafront and you're watching the waves lap up on the shore. Some of the waves are really big, some of the waves, as the wave is kind of going back out to sea and it meets one that's coming in and they kind of cancel each other out and fizzle, but sometimes they'll combine with each other and make a bigger wave. That whole principle applies to sound as well. If you play two identical sine waves simultaneously, then they're going to add their amplitudes together and the sound is going to get louder. Whereas if you play two sine waves completely out of phase, they're going to cancel each other out completely and you'll get total silence. And rather than take my word for it, we're going to actually demonstrate this now. Here we have Pauline, and I'm going to create a simple synth zone. Turn the other oscillators off, so we have a simple sine wave. What does that look like? Well, looks like that. It also looks like this. So we've got two different views of the sine wave here. This is our oscilloscope drawing the sine wave as you'd expect, and here we have span telling us that we have a single sine wave, a single harmonic at 131-ish hertz, which is C. And you can also see that the amplitude of that wave is about minus 31 dB. I'm going to fix the phase at 0 degrees, so every time I press a key now, it's always going to start playing at the very beginning of the sine wave. Now I'm going to introduce a second oscillator. I'm going to fix this phase as well, set that level to 100%. Now when I press a key, it's the same sine wave, but now the volume is minus 25. 6 decibels louder than when I played a single oscillator on its own. If you go and check out my video on decibels, I'll put a link somewhere. In there I describe the way that decibels work is that every 6 decibels that you increase doubles the amplitude of the sound, and we've just seen it there. When you add two identical sine waves together, all of those peaks combine to make a peak twice as big. All of those troughs combine to make troughs twice as big. All of the zeros are still zeros, and now you've just got, somewhere in here, a bigger sine wave. Take one of them away. And it's half as big. So those two sine waves are perfectly in phase. Their playback starts at the same point, at 0 degrees phase, and so they're combining their amplitudes together. If I set the phase of the second wave to 180 degrees and play a key on the keyboard, I am playing a key on the keyboard. You can see C2 is pressed down and we're hearing absolutely nothing. Those two waves are cancelling each other out. So when one wave is high, the other wave is exactly the same amount low. When you add those two things together, you end up at 0. Plus 10 plus minus 10 equals 0. At any point other than 180 degrees, then you're still going to get the same effect where the waves are added together. But now, instead of having the extremes of 100% added to minus 100%, you're going to get some range in between. And you'll see, let's start at 0, and you'll see that from this point, each time I increase this phase, the cumulative wave is going to get quieter and quieter and quieter, quieter. You can see on the oscilloscope the wave's getting smaller and smaller. 180, 179, it'll be tiny. It's more visible than audible. It is actually, if I turned it up, you would hear it. There is a tiny bit of signal there. And at 180 there isn't. They're absolutely perfectly cancelling out. Now that's all very well and good in the perfect physics world of sine waves, but we very rarely deal with the perfect physics world of sine waves. The concept applies everywhere. We're still dealing with waves. So let's now introduce a complex wave into the equation and see what happens when we mess with its phase. So I'll mute this Hallian. I'm going to grab a random audio sample out of Media Bay, and let's hear what this sounds like. So we've got a sequence kind of effect going on where there are tones being played, and there's also like a rhythm effect happening in the background. Again, that's the only thing happening, so we don't care in the slightest about phase. Now I've routed this wave into my master bus, so when I press play, we can control its level. And if I reset it, you'll see that it's playing at, what's that, minus 8-ish, minus 7.5. So its peak value is at about minus 7.5. I'm going to duplicate that wave. Now let's see what happens to the volume. Minus 1.5. So by playing two identical waves, complex waves with rich harmonics, when we play two of them identically at the same time, we add 6 decibels onto our total loudness. We've doubled the amplitude of the sound that's being generated. Those two waves are currently perfectly in phase. They're playing at the same time. You just saw me duplicate the track, and they're both contributing all of their amplitudes at any given moment in time together to double the volume of the sound. Now if I zoom in a long way, make these tracks nice and big, and then zoom in, here you can see the shape of the waves. You can see the positive and then negative. So it's a complex wave, and if we looked at it in a spectrum analyzer, obviously there's an awful lot going on. But at any given moment in time, you've always got some sort of wave going on. That's the whole nature of sound. So now if I pick one of these samples up and move it, so that when this sample is in its positive phase, the sample below is negative. Now let's hear what those two waves sound like together. It's thin and reedy, and it's lost an element of its tonal characteristic. That's what it's supposed to sound like. Yeah, that kind of thing. That's phase cancellation. The two waves are interfering with each other and knocking each other out, and you have an unpleasant effect. That's not the sound that you want to hear. As I move this wave to various places, we're going to get different effects each time. bit this way. These are dramatic changes we're having. It still sounds like one sound. We're operating at microscopic levels here, but it's having a very dramatic effect on the overall tone. That is a situation that you might get if you have two microphones in a recording studio at different distances away from a singer. When you add those two sounds together, they sound wrong because they're out of phase. If you adjust the phase of one of the recordings so that they're playing back at the same point, you'll get the stereo effect you are actually after. So phase constantly has a role to play whenever you're listening to more than one version of a particular sound. Different sounds, totally different sounds, if you're playing a guitar and a piano at the same time, their wave characteristics are so radically different that they have no phase relationship with each other. You don't get this effect of phase cancellation. But anything that has the same period, so that's the reason why I imported a complex wave then, is to prove that any wave when duplicated will phase cancel itself out. It doesn't have to be just a sine wave. And that's why in any instrument that's capable of generating multiple waves at the same time, as is the case in Hallion, you're always going to get phase options, and you very much need to take care of them. They're not just there for show, and you need to understand how they relate to each other. So I hope you found that useful, and if you did, please consider subscribing. If you hit notifications, then you'll find out when my other content comes out. Thanks very much for watching.